Now, we have a brilliant panel for the session today, and I'm very, very pleased to be introducing our first speaker for the plenary and to welcome him to today's event. His name is Steve Smith, and he's the author of Russia in Revolution.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm been doing lots and lots of talks, sometimes to somewhat hostile audiences, sometimes to audiences like this, which I think might be pretty critical, but criticism is good. I knew when I accepted the invitation that I was running the risk of appearing a little bit of a party pooper, but as you shall see, I do have much that I want to say which celebrates 1917. But also, in some respects, would have an analysis of the revolution, which is more an analysis of a revolution that failed, but I would see the failure as inscribed in certain earlier events than those of 1928. So, we're not going to have a discussion afterwards, but I just want to situate myself a little bit. I don't see the revolution as in any way inevitably leading to Stalinism. There were choices that were made, and that's one of the themes that I'll come back to towards the end, just so you can kind of situate me on that key question of Kronstadt, which is one that I think kind of always can be used to situate people on the left. I try to write as a historian about that crisis in a way that shows why the Bolsheviks reacted the way they did, but I think in many respects it does symbolically mark the end of the phase that was instituted in 1917. I think there were alternatives, even in Kronstadt, but that's just to give you a kind of sense of where you can kind of place me in terms of, I suppose, the politics of the left. I thought the comrade asked a really, really good question about what it is we're celebrating if we think, as I think most people do, that this revolution, alas, failed. And I want, just from more the point of view of a sort of historian, professional historian, just to kind of give a sense of where I think the literature is on 1917. I think increasingly people see it as a moment of revolutions, and personally I would put the emphasis, as you do, on the extraordinary self-activity of the working class, a tiny proportion of the population, but nevertheless one that in the 1905 revolution had had extraordinary experiences of conflict, had in some ways developed a new weapon, the mass strike, and notwithstanding the disruptions of the First World War, which saw an expansion numerically of the working class, that in 1917, after February, what is truly remarkable, I think, on any historical scale, is the extent to which workers spontaneously create a range of organizations that in some senses foreshadow organizations that emerge in Spain in 1936, or I would suggest myself, you won't agree, in Yugoslavia at the end of the Second World War, and so on. So there is a kind of way in which this is a very formative moment. That said, would I go along with the idea of this as a workers' revolution? Well, only with severe qualifications, partly because I think the moment when the working class was genuinely driving revolutionary events was quite short. And already the kinds of misery that had driven much working class conflict in 1917, above all the collapse of the economy, the struggle for jobs, those things continue after October and to a large extent lead to very considerable working class opposition to the Bolsheviks very, very early on. So although I would agree with Esme Chinara's excellent overview that in a crucial way, the support of the working class was a vital factor in Red victory. Nevertheless, I think what recent research shows is just how widespread and how deep working class discontent with the Bolsheviks was, and so often it shifted to support for left SRs, left Mensheviks to some extent. But the point I want to make is a bigger one. There's more to celebrate than just the workers' revolution. I feel pretty sorry for peasants in the 20th century. I think they show far more ability to organize themselves, far more ability to become political than Marx felt. And when we say they didn't have the capacity to become a ruling class, I'm not quite sure what that means, certainly compared with other groups. But the point I'm making is that the spontaneous struggle of peasants to take land from the gentry, to redistribute it through communal forms, the enthusiasm of peasants for Soviets, which lasts through the Civil War, to the point where the slogan at the end of the Civil War, the winter of 1920 to 21, is Soviets without communists. I think this all can be put into an argument for making a case for the revolutionary potentiality of the peasantry. There also is a revolution in the army, which I think isn't paralleled in, say, the British Army, despite outbreaks of semi-mutiny that have been referred to in the discussion. Again, this takes the form of self-organization, democratic committees that are not only fighting for peace and a rapid peace, but also for a radical overhaul of the structure of authority in the army. And finally, the movements by non-Russian peoples, who sort of roughly 45% of the former empire, for greater autonomy. Movement that in 1917 is still relatively limited in terms of its impact, or in terms of its demands. The demands are largely for greater autonomy within a Russian federal republican state. But in the course of the Civil War, again, as has been touched on in the discussion, these movements, though politically quite diverse, do provide much of the power for a discourse of anti-imperialism. And this, for me, is one of the longer-term legacies of this revolution, one that I think reverberates right through to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. I'd also see the Bolsheviks as a great force of progress in 1917. I'm still struck, as a historian, by how little we know about the Bolsheviks in 1917. We know quite a lot about the leadership, we know about disputes within the party and so on. But how the party operated, what it actually was like at the grassroots, I think is quite uncertain. We know, for example, that at the front and in many provincial towns, the Social Democrats remained undivided. Local party organizations would send somebody to the Bolshevik Congress in Sixth Congress. They would send people to Menshevik conferences too. But what I think stands out as something to be celebrated is the extraordinary determination of the party to give political direction to these very diverse mass movements and, above all, to call for an end to the war. So I think there's plenty to celebrate. But I want to make a more general, perhaps even a more methodological point, and that is one that I've been struggling with, trying to write about the history of the revolution. And I use it as a way of sort of critiquing what I think of as a kind of standard Trotskyist-influenced narrative of the revolution. And that is to think about the relationship between what we might call structure and agency in all historical situations. I mean, one could think about the world today. If we were trying to draw up some analysis of the global conjuncture, we tend, I think, to think in terms of larger structural forces over which people do not have any very direct control. Indeed, forces that sometimes people are entirely unaware of. They are moving history forward. They might be economic forces, they might be demographic forces like the aging population, they might be changes in social structure which are working away, as it were, behind our backs. And I think we have to think about revolutions as primarily about structural conditions. And I think Lenin recognized this himself in 1913 and again with left-wing communism and infantile disorder. He comes back to this idea that revolutionaries can make a difference when revolutionary situations ripen, and those revolutionary situations are about a crisis in state power, a lack of confidence on the part of the old ruling classes. They're about spaces which open up for popular disaffection to be articulated and organized around. And the Bolsheviks were able in that situation in 1917 to make a terrific difference. What I think happens in the left-wing historiography is that almost immediately after October, we suddenly move, as far as Russia's concerned, into a highly deterministic account in which really important structural constraints are given overwhelming priority. So yes, the Bolsheviks come to power in a situation in which there's collapse of the economy, there is a violent and virulent civil war, there's international intervention and so on, and the solution to that is to say, well, they didn't have any choices, did they? And I would want to say, well, yes, they did. That although these circumstances were incredibly constraining and didn't leave them much room for choice, but nevertheless, there were key decisions that were taken quite early on, removing oppositionists from Soviets, allowing factory committees to wind down very quickly or to be absorbed into trade unions, forms of coercion that were justified as perfectly legitimate means of building socialism. All these things, I think, can be opened up, and we can look at the extent to which there were real constraints and the extent to which certain choices were made, choices that then have down the line unforeseen consequences or consequences that in turn constrain further choices. So I'd want to kind of introduce an idea of path dependency, if to use the jargon, in this, in order to sort of try and complicate a narrative that leads from Leninism to Stalinism. But then what also seems to me to be happening in the left-wing narrative is exactly the opposite when it comes to international revolution. So suddenly, a complex society like Germany, which has a much, much stronger industrial bourgeoisie than Russia, which doesn't have an insurgent peasantry, where there is a very strong reformist government that is used to suppress working-class insurgency, suddenly the narrative becomes all about agency. Well, you know, there were 3 opportunities for revolution. If Trotsky had been sent to Berlin in 1923, say, you know, there might have been a successful revolution. Well, I want to say, hang on a moment. You know, here the structural conditions that operate are different from those in 1917 in Russia. So I know that risks being politically very pessimistic, but I think 100 years on, we need to be much, much more open in the way we think about some of these things and reopen situations that in the past have been seen in terms either of absolute impossibility of things working out any other way than they did, and then somehow jumping in the same breath into extreme forms of voluntarism, agency, where we somehow say, well, you know, with a bit more leadership, a bit more correct leadership, there could have been revolution right across Europe. I don't accept either of those and would want to try and plot a sort of explanation between those two extremes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. That's a really fantastic start to today's final plenary. And just another reminder that you can get Steve's wonderful book, Russian Revolution, just at the back of the room there. So our next speaker is Alex Callinicos. Alex is the editor of the International Socialism Journal and the author of the lead article in this month's ISJ.
Thanks. It's great to be speaking here this afternoon, and in part because it's a kind of reunion, because Steve and I were students at Oxford really very much longer than I'd care to admit, 1970, 1971, and I think we were debating these sorts of questions then. So it's like a dialogue that has been going on for, God help us, the best part of 50 years. But what I want to do, I'll touch on some of the things that Steve said, but what I want to do is to address one very specific question, which was the October Revolution an adventure? Now, that's different from saying that the Bolshevik Revolution was a coup, which is what a lot of the contemporary, essentially conservative historiography says. This isn't an argument here in this hall. And I would say, commenting on one of the things that Steve said, it seems Steve has written brilliantly on the history of the working class in Petrograd in 1917, studying the factory committees in Red Petrograd. But whatever happens to the factory committees, they're simply one dimension of how the working class organises. And for better or worse, a key dimension of how the working class organises turns out to be the Bolshevik Party. And the greatness and the tragedy of the Bolshevik Party is how it seeks to carry through the struggle of the Russian working class in conditions which, however precisely we analyse them, become increasingly unfavourable, above all because of the disintegration of the working class on the ground and indeed alienation on the part of many workers from the Bolsheviks. So we need to look at the working class as itself in a multidimensional set of relationships of which the Bolshevik Party is part until it is irremediably corrupted. But the argument I want to address is that the October Revolution was premature, that it was an attempt to carry through a socialist revolution in a country that was simply too backward to sustain it. Now, this was the argument that Karl Kautsky put at the time. And I recommend people very strongly to read Steve's book. It's a very interesting, very well written, very carefully, very scholarly, very carefully argued and balanced book. It's a very interesting study of the whole revolutionary period. But in there, he seems to me to echo some of Kautsky's arguments. Indeed, he quotes both Jaurès, the great French socialist leader, and Kautsky as saying that it's a disaster to have a revolution in conditions of war. And he also points to what is an undeniable fact, that capitalism has survived the century since the October Revolution, despite the fact the Bolsheviks thought they were leading a struggle to overthrow the revolution. Now, it's a bit unfair of me to criticize Steve when we won't be having discussion, so he can't come back, but I've offered him the right of reply in International Socialism, and he can point out all my errors at length there if he chooses to. But it seems to me that this kind of argument presupposes, which is of course a key argument of Kautsky, that there is a kind of normal course of capitalist development that is peaceful, liberal, and what we now say globalized, and that what happens in the period of the First World War is a kind of aberration. Now, we know this argument because it's very much part of the discourse of liberal globalization that until recently was dominant in the world's ruling classes, and it's been echoed by people on the left, like Tony Negri. But I think one way of challenging that argument is just to ask, okay, capitalism was in trouble in 1917, it survived. How did it right itself? How did it get out of that particular mess? The answer is, it got out of that mess through a chain of economic crises, civil wars, and ultimately the Second World War, with all that entailed in terms of the Holocaust, the ultimate bottom of humankind that was achieved then. And someone has already mentioned Walter Benjamin, the great German Marxist critic. And almost at the depth of this period, not long before he committed suicide, fleeing from the Nazis in 1940, he wrote a little text called The Thesis on the Philosophy of History, or on the Concept of History, depending on the translation. And he says that if you're a real revolutionary, you have to perceive history not as a kind of steady upward progress, but as a catastrophe, as a chain of catastrophes. And elsewhere he says that if we think of history as a locomotive, socialist revolution is like pulling the emergency cord, stopping a catastrophic process of development. And I think that captures very well what the 20th century has been like, a process of cumulative catastrophe. Even in its so-called best period, if you read Ian Angus's book on the Anthropocene, he shows the period of the post-war boom is a period that greatly accelerates the whole process of climate change, which now threatens the planet. That's an interesting thought. If the Bolsheviks and their comrades elsewhere had won, then we'd still face a problem of climate change, but it would be much less acute than we do now. That's an interesting take on history, if we try and, as Benjamin said, rub it against the grain. And Benjamin also says that the thing that corrupted German social democracy, more than anything else, was the sense that it was going with the current of history, because it encouraged passivity. Now, there are people who say that Lenin was a pupil of Kautsky and never really intellectually broke with Kautsky. Well, we've already heard someone, John Rose, quote one of Lenin's key texts from the period before the October Revolution, The Impending Catastrophe and How to Prevent It. That doesn't sound like an optimistic take on history. History is going our way. No, that's not what Lenin says. Lenin says that there are turning points in history that come once and you have to seize them. And if you don't seize them, things won't just carry on nicely as they have up to now. Things will get qualitatively worse. Lenin says, Lenin's argument to win the Bolsheviks to seizing power in the autumn of 1917 is that if we don't act now, the counter-revolution will destroy the revolution and extirpate all the institutions and achievements of the working class. That's a completely different attitude to history from the kind of mainstream Kautskyite one that Benjamin is criticizing it. And it seems to me this then takes us, I'm going to come back, this clearly connects with the question of structure and agency that Steve was talking about it. Now, but the other connected argument about the revolution being an adventure was just Russia was too backward to sustain the construction of socialism. This, of course, wasn't a controversial point. The Bolsheviks agreed with that, but they simply argued that the conditions for socialist revolution exist at an international level, therefore the revolution has to spread. And from the kind of perspective that is developed by Trotsky in his great history of the Russian Revolution, the idea of, in particular, the perspective of uneven and combined development, Russia isn't just a backward hole, it's rather a society whose particular and very peculiar form of integration in the world system, primarily through geopolitical competition between the Russian Empire and more advanced Western powers, involves a very pronounced combination of advanced and backward that makes possible the revolution because of the concentration of industrial workers in places like Petrograd. But uneven and combined development is something that we see not just in Russia. It's no accident that the greatest Western Marxist, apart from Karl Marx, one has to say, the greatest West European Marxist came from Italy, Antonio Gramsci. Because Gramsci, under the inspiration of the Bolshevik Revolution, is grappling with a particularly acute combination of advanced and backward, an industrialized North and a still quasi-feudal South, and the way in which that combination is used to sustain the ruling class in Italy, and how to break out of it, how to learn from the Bolsheviks, and not just learn from them, go beyond them to achieve the revolution. And what we see, why I don't think the Russian Revolution was an aberration, what we see in the years leading up to 1914 is under the pressure of inter-imperialist competition and the growing economic problems that creates, the growing pressure on working class living standards, is a rising arc of class struggle internationally. Not just in Russia, general strike in St. Petersburg, I think in July 1914, just before the outbreak of war, but, for example, in Barcelona in 1909, the so-called Tragic Week, quasi-revolutionary struggles between workers and the army and the civil guard, who are still around, beating up Catalan ministers at the minute. But that's all part of European democracy. Or the great unrest here in Britain, and many other examples. And what we see during and after the First World War is this increasingly militant and combative workers' movement colliding with imperialism and producing a series of revolutionary explosions. So when we talk about the balance between structure and agency, part of the, if you like, the kind of one crucial place where structure and agency meets is the fact that the October Revolution is simply, as someone said in the earlier session, the high point of a series of revolutionary convulsions, which include one incomplete revolution in Germany, a number of missed revolutions, and so on and so forth. And when we talk about, it isn't so much, the argument isn't so much, if the subjective factor, if Trotsky were in Germany in October 1923, there would have been a German revolution, and then, we'd have lived happy ever afterward. Actually, someone wrote a novel based on the assumption that the German Revolution was successful, and history still doesn't turn out very well, but I'm sure he was wrong. That isn't the argument. The argument is that we have a concatenation of revolutionary explosions reflecting these huge structural antagonisms and the mass struggles that they generate that end up in failure, it's true, but as in chaos theory, quite small changes in the initial conditions could have produced radically different outcomes. Say, Luxembourg Steve talks about alternatives like, say, Stalin hadn't become General Secretary of the Communist Party, say Trotsky or Bukharin had, and the difference that would have made. Say Rosa Luxemburg hadn't been such a good comrade and hadn't simply, hung around in Berlin when it was obvious that the rising that Liebknecht had encouraged was going to be a complete disaster. Say she'd done what Lenin did and gone into hiding. Say the German Communist Party had a different leadership and one with the maturity and self-confidence to tell the Bolsheviks to go to hell if they thought they were wrong. That would have produced a significant difference in the situation in Germany, where I think the scale of the instability was very, very profound. We're not talking about one upheaval. We're talking about a whole chain of upheavals. The response to the putsch in 1920, the quasi-civil war that you get in mining areas in the Rhineland, then the convulsions in the course of 1923 and so on. So, again, structure and agency meets here in a way where you could have had a revolutionary breakthrough. Lenin, looking back, misquoted Napoleon. In one of his very last writings, he said, you commit yourself and then you see. In other words, he's saying there's an element of gamble in this. And that's completely inescapable to any revolutionary project. The whole logic of saying that history isn't on our side is that we can't be sure of winning. But nevertheless, there are moments when we have to try. And maybe we will win. And who was more surprised than Lenin, when he's lying next to Trotsky in the Smolny Institute and the insurrection is taking place and he says this makes one's head spin. Saying that, defending that Lenin and Trotsky were right in 1917 isn't to say there are no problems in the whole experience of the Russian Revolution. And I think it's absolutely sensible to try and revisit key episodes, and particularly to interrogate the relationship between struggles from below and the necessary political centralization that is needed to defeat the counter-revolution. For reasons that may seem obvious, I'm rereading Hugh Thomas's History of the Spanish Civil War, and you see there the revolutionary movement that stops the coup in parts of Spain through powerful self-organization from below confronted exactly that problem. How to give the necessary political centralization to defeat the fascists while not killing off the revolutionary democratic impulse from below. They got it wrong, partly because of the influence of Stalinism. One would be a fool to say, oh, the Bolsheviks got it completely right. So they're important questions that we have to interrogate here. But fundamentally, I think that Lenin and his comrades were right to gamble that they could win in the autumn of 1917.
Our last speaker today is the Joint National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, Amy Leather.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, I think it's pretty clear, really, from all the discussions today, just what a momentous event the Russian Revolution of 1917 was. I mean, it was one of the pivotal events of the 20th century. And at the time, it inspired people across the world. You know, that out of the carnage, the slaughter, the bloodshed of the First World War, that actually came the prospect of a better world. A world based on working class self-emancipation, Soviet power and international solidarity. And despite the efforts of the capitalists and the Stalinists ever since to try and bury that real tradition of the revolution, its light continues to shine and provides real hope, but lessons for us today. Because the thing is, the October Revolution was the greatest blow that has ever been struck against capital. In fact, it's the only time that capitalism has been successfully overthrown. The only time in world history where the masses of people took state power in a whole country and started to create a completely different society. A socialist society based on human liberation. And that vision is very important today because 100 years on, capitalism is still failing the vast majority of people across the globe, and there is a growing polarisation as people look for solutions to inequality, to poverty and war. You know, I think at the moment we know, don't we, how the racists and the fascists, they're trying to grow out of the current crisis. But we've also seen this resurgence of interest in socialist ideas. You know, here in Britain, Corbyn's popularised the S word. And I would say that what the Russian Revolution does, it gives us a glimpse of that socialist alternative and shows that ordinary people can win not only gains within the existing system, but that a complete transformation of society is possible. We can get rid of exploitation and oppression completely and have a world where people's needs come before profit. But you see, if we're going to truly learn from the experience, then we have to ask why. Why was it the only ever successful workers' revolution? And I think we have to be clear that Lenin and the Bolsheviks played an absolute critical role. Without the Bolshevik Party, the October Revolution could not and would not have happened. I mean, the February Revolution, which brought down the Tsar, it started without the direct influence of the Bolsheviks. But the October insurrection, the seizure of state power in the name of the Soviets, could not have happened without them. Now, I just want to be clear, it's been stressed in other meetings. By this, I do not mean that October was a coup, involving Lenin and a few of the Bolsheviks. It was, as Lenin said at the time, it was the crowning act of a mass revolution. But it did take organisation, argument and leadership inside the working class by the Bolsheviks. And sometimes in the mainstream narratives of 1917, it's like February and October revolutions are portrayed as being completely unrelated. But actually it's the events between those two revolutions that are crucial to explaining why October can take place. Because the story of February to October is of a growing crisis in Russian society. The provisional government that had been set up after the February Revolution couldn't resolve the issues that had provoked that explosion of activity in the first place. The parties in the provisional government ran away from even the promises they themselves had made. The war continued, land was not redistributed, workers were offered little. And so 1917 is a year of continuing struggle, strikes and protests, drawing in many thousands more people. But it's then a year of upheaval and tumult when workers and peasants really discover the realities of politics in a very accelerated and concentrated form. And as more people are poured into the revolution, the numbers involved in the Soviets also grew and assumed control over most aspects of society. Far more democratic than anything previously seen. The Soviets got rid of this separation between so-called political and economic decisions based on mass participation and workers running things themselves, showing in embryo how a different society could be run. But it was not automatic that a revolution based on workers' power would be victorious. And really the other story of 1917 is how the Bolshevik Party is able to intervene in these events and confront really two central but related obstacles that exist to workers' power, and they're obstacles that still are with us today. The first is the state. Lenin was clear of the need to smash the existing state. The state by which he was talking about the police, the army, the prisons, all the institutions and laws that protects and enforce rule by the capitalist class. It was clear they can't just be taken over by workers and used in their own interests. They'd have to be dismantled because they're not neutral. They're an organ of class rule by that economically dominant class. And although the February Revolution had got rid of the Tsar, that state apparatus was still intact. In fact, the provisional government was dominated by people, the liberal bourgeoisie, who wanted to build a modern capitalist state. And there was what existed was dual power. The Soviets being at the centre of democratic organisation, but the provisional government with formal power, and representing, as I say, the interests of capitalists and the bourgeoisie who really wanted to limit the advances of the revolution, stop the total overhaul of society. That situation could not last indefinitely. One side would have to win out, and there was going to be no room for Soviets in the sort of society the capitalists wanted to build there. And the other obstacle that the Bolsheviks would overcome in 1917 was reformism. Now, this might seem a bit of a funny thing to say, given that there had just been a revolution in February, and mass reformist organisations like the Labour Party didn't exist in Russia at the time. But just because workers had brought down the Tsar did not mean they immediately felt confident to get rid of the state completely and run society themselves. And just because there's no so-called reformist parties, it doesn't mean to say that reformist ideas or consciousness amongst workers and peasants and soldiers didn't exist. Although it is worth noting, as Lenin did, that reformists very quickly emerged after the February revolutions, the forerunners of people we see today. But the provisional government, actually which came out of the February Revolution, it was dominated, like I say, by people who wanted to build a capitalist state. It was supported by the Mensheviks and the Socialist revolutionaries, who actually in the immediate aftermath, they got a big following. They had the majority in the Soviets, not the Bolsheviks. And because, like I say, people got rid of the Tsar, but workers were still deeply shaped by the experience of exploitation, oppression in Russian society, all the feelings of powerlessness that it can breed, that you can think, yeah, I want to have change, but I'm not totally sure we can completely transform society ourselves. You look to others to bring that change, or are willing to find compromises with the existing order. And so what is crucial in 1917 is how the Bolsheviks, and particularly Lenin, intervene in that situation and win over the vast majority of workers and peasants and soldiers. And they do that by articulating the demands of peace, land and bread, putting forward a strategy of taking the revolution forward based on the slogan, all power to the Soviets, and arguing that only by seizing political power could the working class win its demands. But of course, abstract argument alone would not have been enough. It was the actual experience of the failure of the provisional government to actually bring about the changes that changed the minds of workers and broke them from the ideas of the Mensheviks and the Socialist revolutionaries, but only at the same time when that experience was distilled through daily arguments with those who saw the need for further revolution. It's not automatic that just because the government doesn't deliver that you think, oh yeah, we'll make the revolution ourselves. So it's this process of deepening crisis combined with the Bolshevik arguments for a strategy of taking the revolution forward to workers' power that is crucial to winning over the majority in the Soviets, as the Bolsheviks did by the time of October, and to win the argument for the need for insurrection. If the Bolsheviks had not existed, the parties that sought to tie workers to capitalism would have succeeded, and workers' councils would have drowned in blood. But the question is then, why were they able to play that role? Why were Lenin and the Bolsheviks able to win the majority of workers and peasants to a strategy of confronting and smashing the state? And what made the Bolsheviks special was that they combined both political clarity with relentless engagement in actual struggles. And they'd done this not only during the year of 1917, but crucially in the years beforehand. And their political clarity was driven by Marx's idea of working class self-emancipation. Lenin was very clear. A true revolutionary Marxist is not somebody who just recognises the existence of class struggle within capitalism, but is actually someone committed to the aim of working class power. That's what guided the Bolsheviks throughout. They understood power didn't lie in Parliament and looked to what they often called, the creative potential, energy and power of the masses of people. I mean, Lenin would always insist ordinary people are capable of performing miracles. And that was why they argued we can't not to limit the revolution to parliamentary democracy, but for Soviets to take power. And from this flowed their unwavering internationalism. And this was not some moral nicety, but it was an essential prerequisite for working class unity. It meant that the Bolsheviks passed the test of opposing the slaughter of the First World War. You know, they didn't line up in 1914 in support of their own domestic state with its rivalry with other capitalist countries, as like nearly every other socialist organisation ended up doing. And that political clarity ran through the whole organisation. In 1914, when the war broke out, lots of the local party branches of the Bolsheviks were actually cut off from the leadership. But I think just about every local branch of the Bolsheviks came out against the war. They didn't have to wait for a line, from the leadership. And that meant that the whole party in 1917 was very well placed to argue then amongst people for the end to the war then. And also, while the Bolsheviks were clear, it was workers who had potential power to bring down capitalism, they did not ignore others persecuted in Tsarist Russia. As Lenin argued, revolutionaries had to be the tribunes of the oppressed and take up and challenge all aspects of oppression, no matter who directed against, whether it's women, Jewish people, persecuted minorities. But we didn't just have this political clarity or seek it in glorious isolation, standing on the sidelines, commenting from afar. And neither did they just swing into action in 1917, having, sat and honed their theory, ready for the glorious day of revolution. From their very formation, the Bolsheviks had sought to intervene in every struggle they possibly could. And again, when we say intervene, I don't really just mean from outside the working class, really. They were part of the working class and had deep roots in it. They struggled to connect with every workplace and locality through their whole network of party members. And to learn from the working class itself. It's not the case that the Bolsheviks just had all the answers. Their political clarity came from learning from the practice of the workers' movements, generalising from that experience of workers in struggle. The Bolsheviks didn't invent the Soviet. The workers' councils thrown up in both 1905 and 1917, but they were able to generalise from them, to see the potential in them for workers' self-organisation, the embryo of a workers' state. And so, to combine both political clarity with intervention meant the Bolsheviks organised differently from other parties. First thing is, they didn't actually seek to organise the whole working class before the revolution. They organised the most militant and class-conscious section on the basis of clear principles. But they used that organisation to then reach out, work with and influence much wider sections of society. They combined centralism and democracy. Their local groups fed into the centralised leadership. It meant once democratic decisions were made, the entire party could shift behind in it, so it could be effective, could change position rapidly, could be flexible, and not afraid really to change tactics in the struggle, to try and relate to and build out of new situations, whilst never wavering from fundamental principles. But very crucially, the Bolsheviks had built their organisation in the years before the revolution broke out. Such a party, like I'm saying, capable of leading politically and intervening in 1917, could not have been built in the frenzy of revolution, when events and ideas move so quickly. You think about it, you couldn't build an army in the heat of a battle. You can't build effective revolutionary organisation in the middle of an actual revolution. And neither could Lenin have just, turned up in February 1917, or April as he did, after the Tsar had fallen, and really had any impact if he hadn't have been part of an organisation. The fact that he was part of a party that had been recruited, tested and trained in the years before the revolution had, not just rooted in the working class, but had developed trust and confidence amongst wider layers of workers. That's what enabled Lenin and the Bolsheviks to intervene so effectively. In fact, it's right that a revolutionary party constantly tests itself before a revolution. At times when, if you get it wrong, you can learn from those mistakes. Better to do it then than when the stakes are so high. And of course, a revolutionary party will only become a real mass party during an actual revolution. And I think Dave talked about it this morning in the opening plenary. By October, the Bolsheviks numbered something like 300 to 400,000, which is why they were able to win that argument for insurrection. But they couldn't have grown to such a number that was so decisive if they had not had 20,000 or so members, a whole tested cadre already in the party before the February Revolution. So I think if we're going to learn the lessons of the Russian Revolution, It means building revolutionary organisation today. And that is what the SWP seeks to do. Because 100 years on, of course, the world on the surface has changed, but in many ways the features live on. In fact, if anything, they're worse as capitalism gets older and nastier. You know, we live in what's been called a new gilded age, where the world's super rich hold the greatest concentration of wealth since actually before the Russian Revolution. You know, the barbarity of war continues to devastate swathes of the globe, but with the added factor of the potential of nuclear war now. And racism, sexism, homophobia, oppression persist. In the opening plenary, a comrade talked about the impact of the Russian Revolution on black activists across the world and mentioned an American activist called Claude Mackay. Claude Mackay actually advised black people to study Bolshevism because, in his words, he said, "They have made Russia safe for the Jew, it might make the United States safe for black people." Well, 100 years on, America, and for that matter Britain, are still not safe for black people. And we face new challenges, as the drive to profit threatens the very basis of life through environmental crisis and global warming. And all these throw up urgent questions requiring political clarity. Internationalism, that bedrock of Bolshevism, today means, of course, supporting struggles in every part of the globe. It also means opposing all borders, welcoming refugees and migrants, standing up against Islamophobia and racism, and crucially, not just saying these things, but intervening, building a mass movement against racism. But the truth is that the socialist revolutionary forces today are not nearly big enough. Now, I'm not, predicting the outcome of a revolution tomorrow, but if you look under the surface, there is immense bitterness bubbling away, which means that explosions and struggles can break out and happen. And we need to grow now to be in any sort of position to make the sort of difference that the Bolsheviks did. And that means, if you're here today and you're not a member of the Socialist Worker Party, we would like you to join us. But it also means, if you are a member of the Socialist Worker Party, we need to think how we're going to grow. How are we going to build? How are you going to build not only the anti-racist struggle or solidarity for strikers, but build revolutionary organisation in your workplace, in your college, in your local area? Because we've organised, we organise events like today because we know those who rule society would like us just to forget about the Russian Revolution. Well, we're not prepared to throw away that heritage, but we are not just historians. The tasks are so urgent. I only probably have to say Donald Trump in the White House with nuclear weapons as a climate denier to give you a sense of what the urgency is there. And that means we need more revolutionary socialists who can learn and absorb the lessons of the Russian Revolution, but apply them today. Everything we fight for and win today makes a difference, but we have to connect every struggle to that project of working class self-emancipation and working class power. And that means ensuring revolutionary organisation grows now, so it's big enough and rooted enough to play the decisive role, just like the Bolsheviks did in 1917, in the battles we are going to face as we fight for socialism and transformation of society.